Most movies or TV shows depict a person experiencing deja vu in terms of them living the same day over and over and over again. But when we experience deja vu, our brain is doing something eerily similar. Now, while it might not exactly be the same as the glitch in the Matrix or our reality, there is a glitch that's going on in our brains. So, hi, everybody. For those that don't know me, my name is Sabrina. I'm a clinical psychologist, and on this channel, I talk about psychology as we see it in various Netflix TV series and films. And today I'll be pulling some examples from the movie Groundhog Day, that actually its last day on Netflix was January 31st. But if you keep up with my post tabs, I actually made a post a little over a week before it left Netflix, letting you all know if you wanted to watch it. So if you didn't watch it, that one's on you. And about 5-ish months ago, maybe 6 months ago now, I also put a post in there seeing if there'd be even interest in doing a video on deja vu. So thank you for the folks that answered that. And also from that same poll, I asked about trichotillomania, which I will discuss in the next video. So in general, stay up to date with my post tabs if you're wanting to get the 411 about potential videos coming up and things like that. And as I kind of hinted at the beginning too, I'll also be pulling some examples from The Matrix and maybe some other shows, movies as well. There are truly so many that talk about deja vu in this way. So let's jump right in. Let's not waste any more time. So let's start with what deja vu is, kind of the key features, statistics, who it affects, all that good stuff. So deja vu, so it's French for basically already seen is what it means. And so it's this feeling that something happens, whether a conversation or going to a certain place, and we feel like we have already lived that before. So some of the key features of deja vu is that it only lasts a few seconds and that the situation or whatever it is feels familiar, but it's not remembered, meaning that we are not really able to attach a certain place or a certain time to it. We don't know when or where it occurred previously. We just have a feeling that it did occur. And that's because we'll talk more about it, but it's not actually a memory that happened. It's just it feels familiar, so there should be that sensation. And then another thing that occurs is it's often followed by this feeling of that makes no sense. Because like I was just saying, it feels familiar, but you really, really can't place it. And so it just feels incredibly strange for a number of reasons. And there'll be a whole portion about where I'll discuss kind of why this feels eerie when this happens for us. And so the vast majority of people will experience deja vu at least once in their life. It's something like 60 to 80%. So again, the majority of people will experience this. And it's more common for certain situations and for certain ages. So when we are tired, when we're exhausted, when we're overstimulated, these are examples of when it could be more likely that we'll experience deja vu. And also, if we are in novel environment, so if there's some kind of new situations or people or a new place, it's also more likely that this will happen as well. And in just the next moment, I'll talk about why that is. And then in terms of ages, it's actually more likely to happen for younger folks. So for ages around 15 to 25, I talked ad nauseum. If you watched my last few Stranger Things videos that I did, I talked a lot about our brains and when we're in adolescence, early adulthood, how the prefrontal cortex really doesn't stop forming or fully form until we're in like the mid 20s range. And so the brain of a younger person is just pruning more and it's just kind of changing a lot more, which could lead to a lot more misfiring. And as well, when we think about this idea about novel experiences, new experiences from this age, 15 to 25, I mean, think about all the new things that are occurring. Typically, a person might graduate high school and say maybe they go off to the military or maybe they go off to college and now you're at a completely new place, maybe that you haven't been before, especially if you go out of state, out of town, etc. And you're maybe having a new job. Maybe you graduate college and you get a new job, or maybe one of your first jobs. You have a new career. You meet new friends while you're at college or in the military. You have new experiences. Maybe you meet your partner, then maybe you start having children, etc. We're bombarded by numerous new things. And another thing with this age group too has to do with the idea of memory, which is why this doesn't occur often or really at all in folks that are much older. And that's because when we are younger, we are more certain of our memory and we're certain and secure in the fact that something happened and we have a more emotional weight to it. Whereas when we are older, we understand that we can have memory gaps and maybe it's not as reliable. It's really a normal cognitive glitch And after we experience this, even me just being 30, my memory is definitely not what it used to be. And so I've experienced these kind of cognitive lapses, glitches, you would say. And so as we have more of those in life, we just get more open to the fact that maybe we're not remembering things as correctly. So going into the major psychological as well as neurological, so kind of brain level explanations. The most accepted, the most widely diffused, widely believed psychological theory is that of the memory mismatch theory. So what this says is that basically we have two memory systems. One is that of familiarity. So I know this, right? I'm familiar with this. And then the other is recollection. So I remember when and where this thing happened, when and where it occurred. With deja vu, what happens is the familiarity part is activated. So something feels known to us without the recollection part being activated. So we do not know when or where it actually had occurred previously. We can't actually remember what happened because it's not a true memory. This didn't actually happen before. The very next theory that I'm going to talk about is talking about pattern recognition, but it's basically a situation resembles a past experience, and our brain briefly, remember it's just a few seconds, our brain briefly misfires and it tells us that this is a new novel situation. I know this because it feels familiar, but I can't place where. So this creates a really eerie feeling because consciously, I'd say vast majority of the times, if not all the time, we are conscious of the fact that, okay, this has not already happened, but it truly feels like it has. It feels familiar. And that's our hippocampus, one of the parts of our brain sending that false familiarity signal to us that something has happened before. And so there's this mismatch. It creates cognitive dissonance. I talked about this so much on the channel, but basically where we can't hold two opposing viewpoints at the same time. And so feeling like, okay, I know this, so this has happened before, but then also logically saying, okay, I haven't actually lived this before, though. That's a mismatch that's going on, and that feels incredibly uncomfortable. Whenever there's any cognitive dissonance in our brains do not like it because in general, our thoughts are meant to guide us in the world, help us understand what's going on in the world, and help us make judgments to keep us alive. And so, having any kind of opposing viewpoints can be seen as dangerous because we don't know what to do. I don't know how to actually move forward if I have two thoughts about something. So, that's the first theory, again, the most widely accepted, which is this mismatch between it being familiar to us and therefore thinking that it happens, but not being able to actually recollect when or where, a misfiring of our brain. The next is the pattern recognition theory. And this is based on the fact that our brain is a prediction machine. Our brain is doing so much all throughout the day, every second, every moment. Even now, as you're watching this or listening to this, there's so much going on 24/7 with our brains. And so we cannot think about every little thing that we're doing all the time. And so our brain is just great at noticing patterns. That way we can just make easy judgments on, oh, okay, I see this pattern. This must be the same kind of situation as X. So now I know how to act. I don't need to think about it. I can just do whatever I did in that other situation. And so, how this relates to deja vu, if a situation has a similar kind of environment, like say if it's a similar layout, if the people are pretty similar and the general emotional tone of the situation is pretty similar, then our brain goes, oh, okay, I've already stored this pattern before. I know what this is. But it actually can't identify a memory because there isn't one that leads to that feeling of deja vu. So, an example could be when you are going into a new classroom, maybe it makes you think of an old one because the new classroom, maybe the layout is very similar, how the desks are. Maybe it's the same lighting, maybe it's the same kind of energy, like maybe it's just a little bit gloomy in there. And then, boom, this false familiarity comes into play. That's the second psychological theory, that pattern recognition. The third is attentional blind spot theory. And what this is saying is that we are processing something, so we notice something at first unconsciously, and then we notice it, even if it's a split second later, consciously. And so it feels like we're seeing it again when we just basically kind of didn't pay attention the first time. So that's the idea behind the blind spot, is it feels like it's happening over again, but we had already seen it. It was just subconscious, unconscious, so not in our awareness. So it just feels repeated. It's the difference between actually noticing something and then something actually registering to you. And so those are kind of the more common psychological theories that exist. And then there's also some brain involvement too, which this I think is so important and can really show us again that this is not necessarily like a glitch in the matrix or some magical experience, but there's a lot of science behind it. And that is the involvement that we see in the temporal lobes. So the temporal lobes in our brains, they are like right by our temples, and they're responsible for a good bit of. So a huge thing that it does, the temporal lobes, is memory. So I talked about the hippocampus, and this is the area that the hippocampus is stored. So it's in charge of things like storing our experiences, first off, and then also recognizing familiarity. So that means pattern recognition. So recognizing faces or places or context. And so some kind of patterns that emerge. And then it's also responsible in terms of connecting our emotions to memory. And so the amygdala, which is a part of our brain that's involved in like intense emotions like fear or excitement, etc., that is also stored in the temporal lobes, not too far from the hippocampus, and they kind of interact as well. So it's not just responsible for storing memories, but the emotions tied to them. And then the temporal lobes is also helping you right now because it works in terms of our auditory processing. And so being able to understand speech and then interpret speech as well, this is the part that it's responsible for. So the temporal lobe, basically to sum it up, helps us understand what something is and then what it actually means to you. So in the case of déjà vu, this happens when this area misfires. So the hippocampus sends that false familiarity signal, like I was talking about earlier, but it doesn't actually have a memory attached to it. And one of the strongest proofs of this is epilepsy that occurs in the temporal lobe. And so for people who have epilepsy in this area, so experience seizures before, not for everybody that experiences seizures here, but for some folks, when they do, right before it's occurring, they will actually start to experience déjà vu. And in the case of seizures, what we know is it's activating and firing a bunch of different areas in the brain. And so, right as that is kind of happening, a person is then experiencing déjà vu. And there's actually been some research and studies where doctors have purposely stimulated this part of the brain and have literally been able to induce this feeling of déjà vu in people. They've been able to create déjà vu. So again, this is a brief neurological glitch that's happening in the temporal lobe. This is not, déjà vu is not us being stuck in some kind of temporal loop that is the product of some lightning disruption in the space-time continuum. And that reference is for my millennials out there who would watch Sweet Life on Deck. They had a great episode in season 1 called The International Dateline, where Cody was experiencing déjà vu. Every time they would cross this dateline, he'd relive the same day over and over again. So anyway, that one's for you millennials. And so then talking about why this does feel unsettling. I mentioned it a couple times that this can really feel like an eerie experience. If any of you out there have experienced this, it does feel just incredibly uncomfortable. I mean, I definitely don't like this experience myself. And that's really for a couple reasons. And one of the reasons is because it attacks like a core part of our identity, really, our sense of time and our sense of reality. I mean, at a basic level, being oriented to where we are is such a huge part of our experience, which is why people who experience things, say like dementia or even other diagnoses like dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called like multiple personalities, where you might have these gaps in time, feels incredibly unsettling because you're not able to understand what's happening with your time. You don't have a sense of that. And so it can feel like this out of body experience. Same thing with people who have psychosis and aren't maybe in touch with reality, but then you have other people saying, well, the reality you're experiencing isn't actually correct, which happens a lot in these movies too with déjà vu, that the main person experiencing it is the only one that knows it's happening again, but then everybody else is completely unaware, which feels incredibly unsettling, right? Like we rely on our memory to really understand ourselves, to really track our stories. And so if we don't have that, if we don't have a sense of, like, if we lose track of our memories or this process that disrupts it, it can lead to uneasiness and just like a brief break in the timeline that's very much disturbing to us. And this is where I wanted to chat a little bit about the Matrix before I go into Groundhog's Day. Another reason why this can feel unsettling is because it might feel like some kind of signal for danger, What we see in The Matrix is that when there is a glitch, when they experience deja vu, the first time that Neo, Keanu Reeves' character, experiences deja vu, the others freak out. They say, "What's happening? What's going on? Like, what exactly did you see?" And that's because in The Matrix, when deja vu occurs, it's a brief, like, rewriting of the code. The people controlling the program rewrote the code to change something, and for them, that's often a signal for danger. So in this instance, when that happened, that was a signal that they were about to be ambushed, which they were attacked, and now the code was changed to where there was no longer exits in this building. And so for us in real life, if we have deja vu based on something kind of spooky, like Neo saw a black cat, for instance, for us in America, in our culture, seeing a black cat is bad luck, so that can feel very spooky if you have a deja vu experience there, or if it's around being in a place that you don't feel as safe in, maybe a traumatic event that occurred and there's deja vu there, now you can really feel unsettled because you were kind of being put back in an unsafe situation. And really, when something is confusing, unsettling, those kind of negative emotions, often our brain doesn't like those negative emotions. It interprets it as something that it just basically needs to look out for it more because it's trying to figure out, is this something that can threaten my life, this negative feeling, negative emotion? And a lot of times our brain kind of says yes. And so it looks out for it and we feel even more uncomfortable in the presence of those emotions. And then it's tough because it's a singular experience. Like I just said, we're the only ones experiencing it, not others. Like if you've ever had deja vu and mention it to somebody, it's kind of awkward because they're like, okay. Like they're not having deja vu because the situation didn't happen before. Like it's a very personal experience. And so that can feel just so uncomfortable in and of itself. And even in The Matrix, Morpheus, when he's talking with Neo, talks about the fact that the Matrix is all around us. Like you can't see it, but you can feel it. Like you know that something's off, but it's just hard to explain. Which this is true, but that doesn't mean that it's because our whole reality is like we're in some kind of simulation, which people think we might be when some kind of deja vu occurs. They think it truly is, oh, it's a glitch that something is repeating when it's just our brain is acting up. And so in movies like Groundhog's Day, obviously this is more of a metaphor. So what happens in Groundhog's Day is the meteorologist Phil that he goes down to Puxatawny, Pennsylvania for the annual Groundhog's Day festival where if you're not from America, you probably don't know about this, but the saying is that on Groundhog's Day, which this is being released on Groundhog's Day, that a groundhog will come out, he sees his shadow. That means there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter. So basically, that it's going to be just more brutal temperatures because regardless, the actual date of spring doesn't change, but that it'll be more brutal temperatures. But if he doesn't see his shadow, then that means that that we're going to have an easier next 6 weeks. That maybe we'll even have some warmer temperatures. It's not going to be crazy. So he goes to cover this and then ends up reliving the same day over and over and over again. Like he's having the same conversations, it's the same people, it's the same events. So in this sense, the deja vu is externalized. So it's like the feeling that we have internally of, oh, maybe I've already had this conversation or I've already been here. And it mirrors the psychology of it because there's a sense of familiarity, but then there's no progress. Like nothing actually changes. I mean, same in our experience when we have deja vu, it's like there's no closure in a sense with that. It's just, all right, I had this deja vu, but then what? Nothing changes. So in Phil's case, there's so many different things that happen over and over again, but one that comes to mind is he's running and he saves a kid from falling from this tree and just falling on the pavement, I guess. And he says to him, like, you never thank me. You never ever thank me. Every day I save you. I'll see you tomorrow, but you never thank me. So there's no progress. What he's doing doesn't really change the events. He just wakes up and relives it again. And so he's going through familiarity overload versus us in Deja Vu, we're having a familiarity glitch. Then what we see too is that Phil engages in a kind of prediction illusion, meaning that he will kind of finish people's sentences and he'll say, watch, this is going to happen, and he knows what's going to go on there. And this mirrors our own experience with deja vu, where we feel like, oh, I know what's going to happen. Especially if you catch it early enough, say in a conversation, you might feel like, oh, I know maybe this person is going to say this, or the conversation is going to be steered towards this. It can be that kind of prediction of the familiarity. So your brain thinks it's ahead of time, but it's just pattern recognition. And speaking of cognitive dissonance, I mean, more cognitive dissonance is the idea of memory versus a kind of reality conflict. So, like I mentioned before, how just the one person, so whether it's Phil or Cody from Sweet Life on Deck or whoever else, that they remember what occurred. Like they remember the previous days, the ones that they're reliving and what happened, but other people don't. So that creates its own kind of dissonance as well, because that person is claiming to have known what happens, but then the world around them is not. And in our case, our brain claims, oh, I have a memory of this. Then our conscious mind is like, no, you don't. This hasn't happened before. And then lastly, there can also be this loss of meaning. In the movie, what we see with Phil, because he lives the same day over and over for, I mean, it honestly seems like a very long time. Like he's able to learn the piano really well. He's able to like become a doctor. He's able to learn how to, maybe he already knew how to fix a tire, but to do it really, really well. And even when there's like three women in the car and, just do it on the side of the road, right? Like he's able to learn all these skills. So it seems like a very long time he's experiencing this. But we see him go through the kinds of ups and downs where he goes into this kind of nihilism, like nothing really matters. I can just do what I want and try to enjoy all these pleasures. But then there's also this kind of despair that he goes into too, where he does try to end his life a couple times as well to just end the cycle. There's of course the boredom, and then he moves on to kind of finding that meaning from it. So deja vu can tap into the sense of like, if this thing already happened, does it really matter? Like, what's the point? And even like some of the more existential questions of free will and what's going on. And in some kind of scale, it can put us almost in that way of thinking, that kind of tizzy, mental tizzy. But scientifically, it's just this neural hiccup. So remember, deja vu is not actually our past leaking into our present, but it's our brain mislabeling the past as being the present. And that's very, very different. And the last thing I want to talk about as well is another psychological effect that could just explain some of the discomfort that comes from deja vu, which is what's known as the Zeigarnik effect. I talked about this way long ago on my channel, so if this is familiar to you, then thank you because you're one of my OGs. I talked about this a long time ago. This was named after a Russian psychologist whose last name was Zeigarnik. And what this says is that our brain pays much more attention to unfinished tasks versus completed tasks. So things that are basically like an open loop in our brain. And that's uncomfortable because we want to close that loop. We want that kind of cognitive consistency of having a finish. Our brain hates these open loops because it's keeping it active, whatever it is, in our working memory, meaning our brain is working more on it. So think about if you have a computer and you just have a bunch of tabs, like they are still working in the background, even if you don't actively click on those tabs. And that's what our brain's doing. So that's why if you're in a conversation with somebody and you're trying to talk about that great action movie that was starring Keanu Reeves and, why can I remember it? And then 20 minutes later, all of a sudden you pop out with the name, oh, it was John Wick. It's because your brain actually never stopped thinking about it, even if you in your conscious mind did, that it keeps working on it. That's why things like cliffhangers work so well, because it leaves this open loop of what happened. I have to figure out what happened. I have to close this loop. And that's why you keep thinking about it. Same thing with kind of unresolved arguments. And it might be why maybe you or your partner, they're like, we have to figure out this argument now. We can't go to bed without me talking about it because it's unresolved. It creates this kind of open loop. Same thing with, and I'm not like this at all, but for certain people who are really bothered by having like notifications on your phone, like on your text messages or whatever, because it's this open loop of what happened, what they say, what's going on. And so think about this with deja vu. What this is saying, what your brain is saying, is that this situation is familiar. This has happened before, but you have no context for it. Your brain cannot place where it came from. You just can't remember. So in the same way that you might not remember in my example, that Keanu Reeves was in John Wick and you're trying to remember that name, your brain is trying to close and remember, where did I experience this before? But that's especially tough because, again, it's not a real memory. It's not actually connected to a when or where. So your brain is just going to keep working without any kind of closure. So it's just leading you to frustration. A different way that it plays into this deja vu is that generally as people, and then even more so when we're younger, so this 15 to 25 age I talked about in started the video, is characterized by this kind of daydreaming, replaying, or playing a lot of what if situations in our head. So just because we naturally do that more frequently, like we'll imagine a conversation, rehearse a scenario, predict some kind of outcome, replay a memory, our brain never really closes this. And so the deja vu also might literally be your imagination. I don't want to it sounds like I'm kinda gaslighting you in that, but again, like, it could be because of these situations that we replay so much in our own minds, our brain mentally files that, and then when it might pop up in real life, it's like, "Oh, wait, I've actually lived this situation before." So with situations that you know are gonna be stressful, thinking ahead and really practicing and, like, mental imagery, which a lot of athletes do this too for their own games and even when I was a college athlete, when I met with a sports psychologist, this is one of the things he encouraged that helped me out a lot. And so if you do this enough, once you get to a situation and something happens that you think will happen, it feels super familiar. It can kind of be misattributed to deja vu. There is so much research that puts real science and groundedness behind even the phenomenons that can feel as mystical as deja vu. So hopefully this helped you to learn something new. Let me know in the comments what kind of stood out to you about this. I know that this is a kind of out there phenomenon, but hopefully this can just help you feel a little bit more grounded and maybe not crazy.